Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Shabbat Shalom.
We are reading from a Torah portion this week called Bo. Bo is a Hebrew imperative verb. It means go or come on in. Bo el paro is what God says to Moses. Go unto Pharaoh and say the words that changed Judaism and changed history. Let my people go so that they can worship me in the wilderness. And with those words, everything for our people changed. So this is the story of the culminating signs and wonders that would lead to the deliverance of the Jewish people after more than 400 years of slavery. And as they go out from Egypt, they are commanded to observe a ritual that is now one of the most important and beloved Jewish holidays. So what Jewish holiday do we associate with going out of Egypt, with the Exodus from Egypt? How do we memorialize that holiday? What's it called? That's Passover, or the Pesach. Now, there's a lot that falls under the category of what Tevye the dairyman, Tevye from Fiddler on the Roof, would have called tradition. There are a lot of Jewish traditions. Tonight, we're going to look at one Jewish tradition, which has to do with how the Passover is observed. You may be wondering, wait a minute, Rabbi, it is January 31st. Passover this year begins on Saturday night, April 12th. That is still a ways away, and you are correct. It so happens that the holiday calendar and the Torah reading calendar are two different calendars, and they just don't match up. So we read about Passover in January, and we read about Sukkot in May. I don't know why it's that way, but Tevye would say, tradition. Tonight, we're going to look at one small set of traditions, but we're not going to look at it in order to figure out how we do Passover. We're actually going to go a little bit deeper. We're going to explore the question, how do traditions become traditions? How do they stay? Why is it the case that what one generation of Jewish people did long ago is still the thing that Jewish people do today? And in order to get there, we need to look at a few specific verses from this week's Torah reading. First, from the 12th chapter of the book of Exodus. When you enter the land that the Eternal will give you, as God instructed, you shall observe this ritual. And again, if I were Tevye, I wouldn't call it a ritual, I'd call it a tradition. And if your children ask you, what is this ritual of yours? You shall answer, it is a Pesach sacrifice to the Eternal. For God protected or passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt while striking down the Egyptians, but God saved our houses. And then the people kneeled and bowed down, which was their way of saying, we get it, we accept. So again, going back for a moment. When you enter the promised land, the land that the Israelites have been dreaming of for centuries as slaves in Egypt, when you get there, you shall observe this ritual. If you're reading the whole chapter, you will learn what the ritual is. It's the ritual we call the Pesach, or the Passover. In biblical times, it consisted of going into your backyard with a sheep, slaughtering the sheep, burning the sheep on an altar, which is just a fancy word for a barbecue grill, and serving the meat and making a big ceremony around this meal, Passover. Today, we even make it more elaborate with a ritual known as the Passover Seder. Right, which means an order. There's an order to most Jewish things because tradition. But the way in which this tradition gets communicated, gets passed down, is very interesting. It begins with the stuff I've put in boldface. So what we really want to pay attention to tonight are the big letters. And if your children ask you, or even better, when your children ask you, what is this ritual? You imagine this? Generations ago, kids sitting around a Seder table, people passing strange foods, dipping vegetables into salt water, and eating weird, dry, tasteless crackers that we call, right? All of this stuff. It all begins with a child asking the question, what the heck are we doing? And that becomes the prompt for the parents to say, you, the parents, shall answer, okay, here's the deal. This is Passover. It all begins with the child's question. Another verse. So from the next chapter, also part of this week's reading, And if in the future your child asks you, what is this? Again, it's still talking about Passover. In this chapter, it's specifically talking about that strange, tasteless cracker that we eat. The Torah tells us that in all of the settlements of the Jewish people, there shall be nothing that is leavened. Leavened is a word that means yeasty, puffed up, food that swells when you eat it. In other words, food that tastes good. Right? None of that. No cereal, no bread, no pancakes, no waffles. I could go on. It's a gluten-free diet. In other words, not very delicious. Okay, so if in the future your child asks you, what is this? You shall respond, okay, the meaning of it is, with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, did the Eternal take us out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. How does the tradition get passed down? What's the pattern we're looking at tonight? Yeah, Gail. There's a telling. But before there's a telling, there's an asking, right? There's a question first. The child asks, and the grown-up, who's the intended audience of this text, answers. All right, another verse. It's out of order. It doesn't matter. I'm just doing that because I'm building a message here. Okay, for 7 days you shall eat matzahs. The seventh day is a festival for the Eternal. Matzot shall be eaten for 7 days. None of your leavening or chametz shall be seen. None of your fermented dough shall be seen in all your territory. I told you that's the theme of the book. And one more time, in the very next verse, and you shall tell your child on that day, the Eternal did this for my sake when I departed from Egypt. So, in Judaism, how do traditions get passed down? From parent to child, great. And who's responsible for passing them down? Well, right. I hear some people mumbling, parents, ? Somebody else said children. One person said both. And it is both. The child has to ask, but the parents also have to answer. The Talmud makes this abundantly clear. The Talmud actually tells us that if you want to do a Passover Seder, you must ask questions. Specifically, they prescribe a formula. How many questions are asked at the Passover Seder? 4. 4 is actually a minimum. You can ask an infinite number of questions at a Passover Seder, but you must ask a particular 4, all of which have to do with noticing things that are different on this night than all other nights. Ma nishtana halayla hazeh mikol halelot. How different this night is from all other nights. Why tonight are we eating these strange crackers and dipping our food and leaning over, reclining while we're eating? All of the things that are different on Passover. The child says, what's going on here? And the adults around the table say, aha, we have a story to tell you. It's going to take 4 hours before you can have brisket. The Talmud says, even if there are no children present, somebody still has to ask the questions. It goes further and says, even if every single person sitting at your Seder table is a rabbi or a cantor or a Jewish professional, a total expert in every single jot and tittle of Jewish law, knows everything, you still have to ask the questions. So what does this teach us about Judaism generally? What should we derive from this? Questioning, says Aaron, is important in Judaism. My wife, Kelly McCormick, was not born Jewish. I know you're surprised when you hear the name. You say, no. They say Kelly McCormick, she says it's Sephardic. If you were to ask Kelly, why did you become Jewish? She would tell you her answer. She would say, Judaism is the first place where I felt at home in a religious setting to ask questions. And even if I were given answers, I could ask questions about those answers. In Judaism, questions are the key that unlocks the door to learning, discovery, and meaning. And I think it may not be the only reason that our people have made it 3,000 years, but I think the way we feel about questions as a people is one of the biggest reasons that we're still here, and that the traditions that our ancestors practiced a very long time ago are still the traditions that we're practicing today. This weekend, especially for those of you who are in our 6th grade and those of you who are parents of our students, is a weekend for asking questions and for us to let you know that no questions are off limits and your questions belong. Your questions are holy. Some of your questions, parents, may be, when do we start tutoring for this exciting thing called my child's bar or bat mitzvah? Some of your questions might be deeper. They might come from a place of pain. How will we have a joyful occasion when we know that my child's grandmother is very sick and may not even be able to attend our special simcha? These questions belong here. Don't stuff your questions down. Don't stuff your questions down this weekend, but congregation of WRT, always raise your questions. That's how Judaism goes from one generation to the next. The last thing I'll tell you is that there's a secret about all the different questions that are in this week's Torah portion. You notice that 3 times in this portion, a parent and a child are mentioned. There's a 4th place in the Torah, though it is not in this week's portion. It's actually all the way in the last book of the Torah, which is called Deuteronomy, where once again the Passover is presented and says, when your child asks you, what does this mean, you shall say to your child, and explain the Passover. Out of the fact that there are 4 times in the Torah where parents and children especially are mentioned in association with the Passover ritual, the rabbis looked at the Torah and said, aha, 4 mentions of children, 4 different kinds of children in the Jewish community and at the Seder table. So if you remember that there are 4 questions, you might also remember that there are 4 children, or sometimes if you have an old school, more kind of gender insensitive Haggadah, Passover book, 4 sons, 4 children. The rabbis even went farther and said 4 different kinds of children are welcome at the Jewish table. The table of the Jewish people makes room for the one who is wise, who knows everything about Judaism already but wants to learn more, the one who is not wicked but challenging, the one who says, I don't get why you're doing this. Explain yourself, and you do. The one who is simple, the one who's never encountered a Passover Seder before, the one who doesn't even know how to ask a question. Maybe in our world, that's the child who can't speak using language, or the child who struggles to express what he or she is feeling. And even today, we might say, we could include in our table of the Jewish people the child who isn't here, the child who can't be here. Tonight, as we heard from Rabbi Citrin, there are still almost 90 of our people. We pray that by the time Passover comes, please God, sooner, may all our hostages be released. Keni hi ratzon, may this be God's will. Shabbat shalom.